first read your work, heard your voice, powerful voice, working on Ruth Burgess's books, her anthologies. You were in there, and that's where I first read your stories and your poems. So I just wanted to thank Ruth for that, for including you in those books, and that's really probably what gave Wild Goose the idea to, have you, writing, more for us for the 2 books you've done so far. So before you read a few pieces, I'll read from the blurb of your book, just to give folk a flavor. Jesus unflinchingly walked the road that he had chosen, knowing its cost. In our lives, we find ourselves on roads not always of our choosing, often puzzling, sometimes full of light when faith seems easy, sometimes darkened and troubled. As we journey through the events of Holy Week, we find Jesus sharing that human perplexity and struggle, always fully engaged, determined to accompany us on the journey that lies ahead, giving us confidence to pray and act for the needs of those close to us and for the needs of the world. Janet Killeen uses a variety of perspectives to get close to the events of Holy Week. Some of the events are far from holy, treacherous, hostile, and increasingly isolating for the man at their heart, who comes to us in his isolation, in confrontation and rejection, in the sorrow and anguish he experienced, so that we might never be alone. And just to give some background of Janet, Janet Killeen studied English and American literature and taught in the London Comprehensive School for over 35 years. She's published poems, short stories, and 2 novels, and is a regular contributor to Wild Goose books. So, Janet, I think when we talked about this, you maybe wanted to start with the poem Parade.
Yes, but let me just say what a huge privilege it is to be involved in Wild Goose publications. It's opened a window for me that I'm very, very grateful for. And yes, it's a challenge, but it's a huge privilege to work for Wild Goose, and to try to, I suppose, bring the kind of perspective that I have, but to feel that it's accepted and respected, and that's very special. So yes, this poem is called Parade, and I wrote it before the events of that have unfolded in the last few terrible weeks in Eastern Europe, and I wrote it thinking about the kind of things that dominated my time in the 1960s, I suppose, when I was a teenager and then a student. When you used to see those May Day parades in the Soviet Union, in the Red Square, and also, of course, with what we see in North Korea. So it was that was in my mind when I wrote this, but I'm aware that it actually is terribly relevant. Parade. On a dais, the self-proclaimed god rivals the scant sunlight, glittering breast encrusted with honours, terrestrial dominions conquered or claimed, rank upon rank of high-stepping soldiery swivel and snap to acknowledge him. The dull sheen and weight of missiles lumber on vast wheeled carriers. Tanks grind by, their turrets turning, gun barrels phallic in salute, and the hypnotized crowd sways as one in adulation. While on a street not far, perhaps almost parallel, an alley of the old town, now deserted by once captivated crowds, silence falls, and the dust stirs as the wind is blowing as it will. A man on a donkey rides patiently, gently towards eternity, showing it could be otherwise.
And at the end of that poem, in the reflection for folk to think about, Janet, you write, in the gospel accounts, this is the hour of triumph, the hour of acclamation, the roar of the crowd, the strewn cloaks and palm leaves, the confident, excited affirmation of the disciples. How could it turn so quickly in just the space of a week to the ghastly silence of the streets leading to Golgotha, to the weeping, comfortless women, to the jeers of the religious leaders and their manipulated mob? Was it in the hours after the triumphant entry when Jesus, at the height of his popularity, did not take the city by storm that Judas turned away? When the power he saw demonstrated, the blind given sight, the dead raised, the crowds fed, was manifested not in conquest, but otherwise. And you ask the reader, thinking about the concepts of power or kingship, how might we explore otherwise? Do you want to read a story, Janet? A longer piece?
Yes, I'll do that.
So we'll all just kind of sit back and listen now.
Sit back and, yes, relax. This story is called That Night. Silent feet, silent tongue. That is how they train you. And we don't tell them, sharpened ears, sharpened sight. We see and hear everything. When we can snatch the odd time off between dinner and bed maybe, or in the heat of the afternoon when the mistress is resting, we meet up in the marketplace or the wine shops down the alley by the gate and catch up on the gossip. We all know one another, share the same secret life, comradeship, where the mask can slip a little, small jokes, kindness, maybe even the hope of a future husband or a wife, if the small savings can be garnered away and the luck turns, who knows? But this evening, how can I begin to talk of it? It's very late now, but there are still lights in many houses and torches carried along the streets, and the crunch of soldiers' feet, the scuff and scurry of sandals, and a distant murmur of unrest, like the growl in the back of a wild dog's throat, the wild dogs that hang around the rubbish, snarling. Sharpened ears, sharpened sight. I'm trying to sort it out in my head. Who I was even yesterday is not who I feel I am today. It began, I think, with that odd moment by the well. I'd drawn up the water, filled the great jar, and was hoisting it up to carry it through the streets, the last of many, but this one to be carried upstairs to the guest room. I was tired. Maybe I've always been tired, since the day my father sold me in payment of his debts. Just out of childhood, 12 years old, and I remember my mother weeping, down in the dust, begging him. And he shook her off and sent me north to the city with a friend of his, in a cart full of new wineskins and goatskin rugs, stinking and hot. And I sat still as stone, and the tears have never come. You could say I was lucky. When I hear other stories, I know that's true in a way. I came to the house of a good woman and her family, none of them cruel or rough, and she put me in the care of the steward and the cook to train me to serve at table and to learn to prepare the food. They were kind mostly, except when the household got very busy at the festivals. And once a year I was given a gift of money and clothing, and the hope grew that one day they might set me free. Although, when you think about it, freedom is a blade with two edges, and one points towards you. There's no life in these dark and churning streets for a woman on her own. 10 years since I came, just a child, And now I carry the water and attend to the guests and serve at table, silent, watchful, just a pair of hands, really, until those odd hours of fleeting laughter and talk in the stolen moments of the day or night. So I'd filled the great pitcher and turned, feeling the balance of it, straightening up to begin the walk to the house, and a man stopped me. "Daughter," he said, "let me carry that for you." I thought he was joking, or if not, maybe it was one of the slaves like myself, wanting to give me a hand. But men don't carry the water, that's a woman's job. "No," I said, slowly facing him, unsure how to deal with this. If it was a joke, it was a bad one. If it was a genuine offer of help, I needed to be sure that I could trust this man and know he was not looking for any favors. I looked. I'd never seen him before, and even though I looked hard at him, I could not tell you the details of his face. "My daughter," he said again, "you're very tired. Let me take this for you." As I looked at him, I felt as if he knew me, and I was afraid that the crying might begin and never stop. "Don't worry," he said, very gently, and took the heavy jar and balanced it carefully and walked away. A few heads turned as he walked up the street, and a couple of men began to follow him. Gathering myself as soon as I could, I followed too, anxious and hot, as the sun was now moving further overhead, but I need not have worried. He took the pitcher to the house, climbed the outside steps to the upper room, while the two men behind him went inside to talk to the master. They had taken no notice of the man. As I came near to the door, he came downstairs, smiled, and was gone. I went to the back of the house, puzzled, silent. Then the master of the house came in almost immediately and gave directions for the upper room to be prepared for 13 guests to eat the Passover meal. There was then no time to waste. Food to prepare, not just for the family, but for these guests. The room to be spotless, and the furniture and cushions ready for them to recline around the long table. Lamps to be set out and wicks trimmed. Pitcher of water, the jug, bowl and towels for their feet to be washed. My job before the meal could be served. You could tell from the whispered excitement in the house that these were important guests and everything must be perfect. The silent, sharp-eyed service that I was trained for. The sun turned red and sank lazily beneath the clouds that rise from the great sea far west, and I've never seen it, but so they tell me. Dusk gathered in corners and spread slowly over the city, and the lamps were lighted and torches flared in the streets. I remember standing at the doorway, out of sight, as the men came up the stairs, bringing with them the sweat and restlessness of the day and its dust in their hair and clothing and on their feet and sandals. I stood ready with the bowl and jug and towels, waiting for them to take their ease on the cushions around the low table. They were excited, talking and gesturing as they took their places, and I noticed, as you do, the way in which they pushed for position to be near the head of the table. They did not notice as I moved forward, expecting to kneel and begin the task of easing their feet and cleansing them for the meal ahead. Nor did they notice as he came in, and as he silently took the bowl and jug and towel from me and began my work, the slave's work, finger on lips to me, and that same steady look, the gentle smile, then the intense focus on the feet of his friends, washing them with great gentleness, as if caressing them with kindness. At first they thought it was the slave, so familiar was the pattern of hospitality. They barely recognized that it was happening. Then one of them, a burly man, who seemed by the strength of his voice and presence to have some sort of leadership, swung round and realized he was loud in his protest, loud with the strong accent of the North. But his friend, who I see now was the true leader of the group, persisted. He was red-faced with embarrassment as he submitted, and the rest of the group were frozen, I thought, speechless, as their leader washed their feet and dried them carefully, tenderly. It takes a long time to wash 12 pairs of feet. The room waited, the meal forgotten, and the evening gathered itself around the table. I felt the darkness waiting as if about to spring. The oil lamps held it at bay. Then, at last, the figures came to life. The meal began, and I ran to and fro with platters of meat and bread and the wineskins to pour into the jugs and then to cups, and it takes a steady hand, and all the special ceremonial food of the Passover. I watched them and listened as the conversation rose with argument and flourishes of hands and arms and food and cups spilt onto the table. Who's the most important? They were saying. Which of us will be in the place of power when the kingdom comes? Well, I thought to myself, have you learned nothing? But I had to go then and get more food, more to drink. And when I returned, the group had quietened. Is it me? Is it me? They were asking. But I do not know the question. There was one moment as I lingered when he stood and took the bread and broke it, tore it apart and said, a strange thing, my body, he said, and handed it to them. When I went back to clear the table, one of them was rising to his feet and leaving hurriedly, and the stir of air at his passing caused all the lamps to splutter, and the darkness entered as he left. I brought light quickly and renewed the lamps, but the mood had changed. They shifted uncomfortably, then stood together to sing the psalm and left down the steps and into the dark streets. I did not get away until much later that night, after the first cockcrow, but you could sense that rising murmur of excitement, anger, fear, call it what you like, it was all of those things, and the city still hums with it. I joined old friends at the wine shop and heard the stories that were running around like jackals about a betrayal and an arrest in a garden. Malchus, slave of the high priest, came in clutching his ear, and we all marveled at his story and touched his ear, and the tale grew of the man in the garden and the followers who ran away. Anna came bursting in with the thrill of her story, always a gossip. I recognized him, I tell you, she said, hands on hips. He was one of them, one of those men from Galilee. You could tell it by his voice. I've seen him around with that Jesus. Big fellow, but not so big now, I can tell you. 3 times he said he didn't know him. Others came with the details of the show trial at the high priest's and then Herod's court. And we all knew the next step would be the Romans. The taste of the story turned bitter to all of us, and we found ourselves scattering, even the most talkative, frightened by the events that were overtaking us, events of great heaviness, terrible things. I thought of the man. He had called me daughter. No one had done that since the day I left my home, a slave. 2 of my friends were walking up ahead as I returned through the alleys to the house. Fragments of their talk reached me, and they stay with me now. They say he sold him for 30 pieces of silver, they were saying. The slave price. The price my father got for me.
Thanks, Janet. You not only write well, you read very well. It's nice to hear your voice, you know, looking at your words and hearing your voice. I was, you know, going through your book this time, I noticed how, I don't know, to me, how sort of cinematic your writing is. That's just something I noticed when I was going through. So I'm curious, how do you make your choices about who to write about, and how do you walk the line of using the Bible as text and sometimes imagining freely? I mean, can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yes, I will try. I think I like to imagine that these people lived and exchanged and met each other and had lives outside of the biblical text, because we only have a fragment of their lives, don't we? We have a dramatic moment when somebody is healed, or when we hear of somebody. But in terms of that community, the community of Jerusalem, and certainly the communities in Nazareth and Galilee, people would have known each other. People would have watched events and wondered and thought about them and experienced them in ways that we know nothing about because they've not been written about. So I think I like to take the point of view of an imaginary observer. How would people have felt? How would you have felt when these things were going on? How would you have talked about it? How would you have understood it? And also, I think I like to take the perspective of keeping a secret, really, what is going on until the end, so that you don't immediately think, oh, I know who that is. That's so-and-so. That's the person who's being healed, or that's the person who's being imprisoned, or whatever. I like to feel that I'm surprising the reader with some aspect of the story.
You have surprised me a few times when I've been reading through.
Well, that's
I've gone back and go, oh, okay, now. I thought it was somebody else. No.
Yes. I think that's really pleasing. That would be absolutely what I would aim for. That it might give you a surprise. What I think I said in the introduction, didn't I? How much I love that poem by Philip Larkin. Oh, yeah. And that sense of a tender shock, that it might be, oh, I've never thought about that before, when you read, perhaps. I'm sure it doesn't work for all the stories, but that's my motivation, that it might bring something freshly to life, and for us to say, this was actually real, and people had real feelings and real emotions and real reactions, just as we do, and therefore perhaps it can engage people afresh.
Thanks. So we'll have a little time if you want to ask Janet some questions or just comments. But before we do, you can win a free book. So all you have to do is email me at Neil, and it's Neil at ionabooks.com. That's Neil at ionabooks.com. And really easy question. Just give me a title of one other Wild Goose Lent or Easter book. Isn't that an easy question? Gosh, there's so many. And you could look up on the website if you don't know one for some reason. I wouldn't know you did that, would I? So that's fine. So phone lines are open now. So if you have the right answer, you email me. I won't check tonight, but I'll check in the morning. And the first person that gets the right answer, you know, the first person, I'll send them a free book, and you can get, well, Janet's new book if you don't already have it, or the book Janet wrote before that for us, Towards Bethlehem. There's the cover. It's a lovely cover of a donkey, and those are stories and poems for Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany. So you can have that very early for the season. So I guess I'm saying you could have, either of Janet's books, or if you have those, or another Wild Goose book. Yeah, you can. I'll ask you what you want if the person who's lucky enough to get the right answer. So just give me a title of any other Lent or Easter book. Did I explain that pretty confusingly, or is it pretty
Fine.
clear?
That's
Okay,
fine.
we'll see what happens. So phone lines are open now. Okay, why don't we, does anyone have any, Iona and I'll have a look, see maybe who has their hand up or something like that. I'm sure we'll work it out. Do you have any questions for Janet or any comments or anything? Thanks. Looking through to see if anyone does.
Ruth B, I've asked you to unmute, so you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, okay. Janet, it was really lovely to hear you read. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Into it, and it was great. And it's been lovely to see both of your books coming through as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it really was nice to hear Janet's voice.
Well, Ruth has, I've had the privilege of being involved with Ruth's books, and she's opened doors for me, and I'm very grateful. So it's nice to say that to you, Ruth. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Anyone else with a wee comment or question? Okay. Robert Day. Hi, Robert. You have to unmute, I think, Robert. I'm not sure.
Have I done that? Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Janet, you know I appreciate your stuff. I've said it before. This is different. For having done a theology degree, I'm aware of all the kind of Christology, and as you've said, there's so little really when you unpick it. We've only got like little glimpses of who this Jesus was and still is. And Christian theology has taken a long and very winding course in some quite specific directions.
Yes.
What is so lovely about hearing you and your stories is just a reminder that it is about our own personal engagement with the story. And you are opening doors for us to step into the story. And you're in the same tradition as Saint Ignatius of Loyola in doing that. And also very dear to my heart, the cantatas of J.S. Bach, because interspersed in his music are these chorales which the congregation offer their own devotions and step into the story themselves. So this is a rather long-winded comment rather than a question. I hope that's okay. But I really do appreciate what you're doing, and at the end of the day, I find that's profoundly meaningful as we aim to engage with the Christian life. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Robert, very much.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there is an Ignatian root there, Ignatian contemplation, although it's not something I know a lot about. But, yeah, in your introduction, you write, I wanted more than anything to connect imaginatively with the humanity of Jesus and our humanity as well, of course.
Yeah. Yes, I do feel that very strongly, that church and theology and liturgy can sometimes completely obscure the fact that here was and is within the heart of God the feeling of our existence, the nerve and bone of our existence is somehow within the heart of God. No, carry on, please.
Oh no, sorry, you finish.
No, I suppose that is how it is the only way I can make sense of my own Christian walk is to have this much more sense of open and relational experience and pursuit of God through the humanity of Christ. We know that we are heard, felt, and understood. And it's very, very much needed, I think, that people should hear that message.
Just scrolling through to see if anyone else wants to ask a question or comment. I definitely myself came to the Iona community and to Christianity, however you want to define that, through Iona worship, which was so much based on poetry and story. That brought me in. Theology would never bring me in a million years. I mean, well, you can argue. I mean, yeah. Okay. Jen, I think you wrote a poem. This is not a poem in this book. It's a new poem.
Yes.
With
I've got a nice message from Jane.
For this evening, I think.
Yes.
Do you want to tell folk about that? And we'll just maybe, we'll end with that. And we'll end with the poem, and I'll just thank everyone for coming tonight and for listening and for commenting. Thanks so much to Janet, and thanks to Iona there for hosting, doing the technical Zoom stuff, which I couldn't do. So it's good to have somebody on the team that knows how to do that. That's great. And Isabel did that before, and we appreciate Isabel too. And thanks to the folk I work with. Thanks to everyone who supports Wild Goose. And have a good night. Go ahead, Janet.
Thank you. How does one sit silent really with what is going on in Ukraine? And I think it is, we all find our own way of responding through giving and generosity and hospitality and tears and care. And I suppose one of the ways that I've responded was to write a poem about it. So this is my response. And the poem is called Prepositions. Between the bandage and the wound, beneath the stumbling feet upon the path that leads to exile, within the crook of an arm that holds a child numbed with terror, along the barrel of the gun, trembling in the hands of the recruit whose training taught him how to shoot, but not the cost of killing. Beside the pit of hurried bodies buried, where a mother flings her cries to reassemble limbs dismembered in blast-shaken air. Within the harsh constriction of the throat, strangled by tearless grief and rage, and in the mouth of truth, told by a priest who can no longer echo lies and pays the price. On station platforms, crammed and trampled. Then at the border, where the gates of refuge open. And at the checkpoint which is closed, there too, knocking at the slammed door, beating with the pulse of the human heart, entreating entry, he is found. Always and everywhere, he is there.
Good night, take care.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.